Hi, this is Paul. I saw this video with Adam and Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley is an English radio producer, commentator, host who has been doing a wonderful show that I've actually been listening to for many years now called Unbelievable. And he's had many Christians, atheists, skeptics, people from different religions, and he interviews them and they get to state their case. I've always enjoyed the show. The most annoying thing about the show, though, is it was a radio show that had these frequent commercial breaks, which always annoyed me. And YouTube has just been a wonderful thing because things go on and on. And Justin's been doing more interviews. He had a Jordan Peterson episode last year. He's got Brett Weinstein talking with Alistair McGrath, who's a scholar I very much appreciate. And so Adam had him on his show, and it's been sort of interesting. Adam started out with Flink Club doing a lot of Jordan Peterson clips, and YouTube sort of changed their policies, and so Adam's been doing a lot more conversations and debate type things. Although Adam debates, I'm going to be on his show next week, and Adam debates, it might be this week by the time I post this. Adam debates are nice, are good conversations. Adam really tries hard to keep the conversation productive, and Adam is an atheist. He's not an anti-theist, and so you're just in a Rodney King-esque way, he wants us all to get along. But I was watching this conversation they did with Justin, and Justin said something that I thought I wanna talk about this, because I think a lot of people listening to me and listening to this conversation would get a little bit lost by what Justin has to say here. So, see if my new software regime works.
Yes. Well, I would say I love the fact that you want to collaborate, and I think we're much better off trying to find points of commonality than simply slagging each other off. So I had Jonathan Haidt on my show earlier this year, and he's really popular among many Christians, especially evangelical Christians, because I think he takes religion seriously, and he takes he has obviously written books more or less on the way that religion can have a very positive impact on psychology and morality and everything else. And so he in that way, he's a breath of fresh air, him and Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson, to the Richard Dawkins and the Sam Harrises and the Christopher Hitchens who are so anti-theistic and simply want to tear it all down. So in that way, I appreciate that, and I would say yes, let's collaborate. But again, it's just at that point where where ultimately we've still got a difference of opinion, which is what is reality ultimately founded upon. And I want you to meet that reality. For me, it's a person called Jesus Christ, and I'm not going to be. I'm going to be happy if we can have some measure of agreement, because we both appreciate the value of religion in the world, especially Christianity. But I'm not going to be satisfied fully until you, Adam, have come to the same.
I love how Adam laughs there. It reminds me towards the end of the book of Acts, Paul gives his plea to, is it Festus? And Festus just laughs. He's like, yeah, you think you can convert me right now?
The same view as I have, that I'm just talking honestly here. Because I really believe that Jesus Christ is the center of history, the center of moral philosophy, is the center of everything. That's my worldview. That's why I'm a Christian. I'll always feel we've only got halfway there if we're just agreeing on, we can kind of come up with similar moral frameworks from both different perspectives or whatever. And so I'm just talking honestly, that's just the way it functions for me.
Well, I'm being honest with you too, and I hope I don't come off as too patronizing. I have 4 more questions, and these are probably the most.
So it's a good conversation, and I think that kind of honest conversation and putting their cards on the table is really a good thing. Justin says, what is reality ultimately centered upon, founded upon? I want you to meet that reality, and for me, it's a person called Jesus Christ. That is a biblical way of talking. That is a very respectable Christian phrase to use, but it is I think for many people, many of the people that listen to my channel, I think it just doesn't make much sense because of the materialist worldview. And Justin knows this. Justin, part of what's so, I was so glad to see Justin's written his own book and he's done his own video. He has his own talk because he sat through how many of these conversations time and time again. And so he knows all of the arguments and he hears it trotted out. But this way of framing it is so hard for, I think, a lot of people to understand. The center of history, of moral philosophy, of everything. I've always felt we've only got halfway there until you become this, and then, of course, Adam laughs. Now, this language isn't totally foreign to us. In fact, in many ways, this language is phenomenological, and you can find it in the song that immediately comes to mind. I didn't know even who sang it, but it was just ringing in my head from the 70s by Harry Nilsson. I can't live if living is without you. And how many times and how many places and how many ways doesn't a romantic partner become the center of someone's world? And so we access that, and it's part of that reason that so many Christian songs and so much Christian material sort of go there in terms of Jesus being the center of my love and all of that stuff. And sometimes Christian worship and evangelical churches and contemporary music can turn into love songs for Jesus. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. That is an appropriate thing. In fact, it's probably more appropriate for a Christian than someone singing a song like this, but I'm not going to throw stones at this guy either. What I mean by this point is that this is a way that we use language, and it's a way we understand it. But for many people for whom the primary reference for Jesus Christ, they're skeptical about Christian claims of his divinity, to say that he is the center of history is a little bit simplistic, a little bit misleading, especially when you see what, let's say, the Apostle Paul does with Christ in the New Testament. Now, I think another way into this is actually the morality conversation, which is a conversation that Adam really loves to go to. I've had some conversation with Adam on objective morality. I'm sure it'll come up next week when I talk to Adam, because if you talk to me about this stuff, I'm going to immediately begin to ask you to clarify and up the resolution on your terms, because I have some skepticism with respect to the framework that we are approaching all of these things with. And many of these words are just sort of out there and taken for granted. Now, what we're seeing is that they're out there and taken for granted on the skeptic side, or on the modernist side, that everybody knows what objective means. Everybody knows what morality means. I don't think so. I think we are using those words as shortcuts of referral, and in fact, we use these words within communities. And just like Justin's language of Christ is the center and I want you to meet him, that's used within a community, and it's perfectly legitimate within the community, but outside of the community, it's just going to be problematic. And I think a way into this is to, in fact, listen to this good bit of the conversation that happens towards the end, where Adam really starts to get into the morality questions.
So you've talked in previous conversations about morality being arbitrary. This comes up quite often when you're making a case for the theistic worldview. My question is, can an arbitrary morality survive in the real world? And if it can't, isn't morality by necessity objective?
Well, depend. I mean, so it depends what you mean by arbitrary. So what I would mean if I was saying that that morality might look arbitrary is if, as I say, if evolution in one culture develops a misogynistic view of women, if that's the direction that culture goes, and in another culture it develops a view that men and women are equal, if all that we've got to go on is what evolution happens to hand us, as our moral framework, then it looks pretty arbitrary. As arbitrary as whether we developed 5 fingers or 6 physically, you know, it's going to be pretty arbitrary. Which now, if you're saying, you know, in your view, those inferior moralities, the misogynistic societies or whatever, inevitably die out through some evolutionary process and produce, you know, a society where people are equal and valued and so on, then obviously it's not arbitrary in that sense. You know, there's a way in which if if evolution always produces these optimal outcomes, then no, it's not arbitrary. But I would say it's only, firstly, I don't fully buy that story that evolution has this, always produces these optimal outcomes. And secondly, you still have to judge what counts as an optimal outcome, you know? Why is the flourishing of all sentient life the optimal outcome for Sam Harris? Or why do some people place the emphasis on humans in particular? Why is that the optimal outcome, that humans flourish in culture? You know, another, you know, a Peter Singer would say, well, you're being very speciesist if you're going to put all of the emphasis on humans. What about all the other sentient creatures out there? So there are lots of different standards, you know, that we might choose as our kind of, you know, that we want to be the optimal point. And the point for me is that if there is some standard out there, it transcends all of these biological and evolutionary categories. We've got to look for what this standard is, and if we think we found it, it leads on to the very natural question: what's it grounded in? If it's not the, I mean, we're circling back obviously to where we began here, but that would be my view. It doesn't feel to me like you can just get your optimal sort of. You've still got to choose what's optimal. That's a philosophical kind of decision you make, and whether evolution brings that about, well, it may or it may not. You know, sometimes we might have to act against our evolutionary instincts actually to actually act in a moral way in the end. Well,
I think sometimes you do definitely have to do that. An example that I sometimes use is, and you're exactly right. What the goal is, what the yardstick is paramount. If you're designing a moral system to produce some kind of outcome, you know, that whatever that outcome is going to affect how you design the moral system. If you're, let's just say you're designing an airplane, okay? There are a lot of different ways that you can design an airplane. But if you're designing an airplane for speed or designing an airplane for, efficiency in trafficking people, you would design those airplanes completely differently. But those different goals, speed versus efficiency, are in the end, they're objective. They are objective. They would make the actual design features objective.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think is the way in which Sam Harris gets to objective morality, because he says, here's the goal, you know, some kind of flourishing of human creatures and so on. And then you can objectively tell that if you do this, and if you do that, and if you do the other, that you're progressing towards that. Just like, you know, if your objective is to make the fastest aeroplane, then you can objectively create the best conditions for that aeroplane to fly fast. But of course, that's the whole point. That's the glaring sort of thing in Sam Harris's whole philosophy, is that he's made a kind of his article of faith in the whole thing is this idea of human flourishing, and the whole point is, but where did you get that principle from? And I would say exactly as you've said, once you've got an objective, fast aeroplane, an efficient aeroplane, whatever, then of course you can measure things, and I've no problem with that. You know, science can be really helpful in measuring things, but the point is, we have that objective is going to be something that lies outside the scope of science. It's going to be something we philosophically have decided is the right way of going about things. So yeah, I mean, it's like if it's a bit like a game of chess. Sometimes atheists tell me morality is just like a game of chess. There are good moves and there are bad moves, and we don't need to appeal to a supernatural being to know that. It's just obvious. And the point is, yeah, there are, for the objective of that game, which is to capture the king or whatever. But you've still got but they're only good and bad insofar as they relate to an objective, okay? And in morality, you have to establish that objective before you can start to talk about things being good or bad in the first place. So until we get that kind of if we decide that the best kind of morality is for white Aryan individuals to rule the world, that's our objective. There are going to be objectively good ways to get to that outcome, and Hitler probably was onto some of them, But if we've decided on a very different objective, there's going to be another whole set of objective ways in which we can get to that outcome. And so for me, it all still boils down to something that sits outside of our particular system, because we have to decide in advance what's going to be the objective.
Do you fundamentally accept that we want to maximize human well-being? It seems like Christianity was designed to maximize human well-being.
In the sense of yes, but it might not be the same conception of well-being that a Sam Harris because again, some people think that well-being is essentially having the maximum amount of pleasure, let's say, the maximum amount of freedom or whatever it might be to do what we want. That might be their conception of what human well-being ultimately looks like. But Christianity may say, actually, there's a different conception of human well-being. And actually, it turns out that actually some things actually being limited, so for instance, your sexual freedom or other elements of your life, they may actually serving others, doing things that are actually in some ways not immediately obviously beneficial to you, may actually be something that God wants to create in your life in a way that molds you and shapes you into a better type of human, into a person who is more, in a deeper way, a more fully flourishing human. And from that point of view, I'd say there's a sense in which you want to establish what this well-being is to start with. And Christianity, I think, is the ultimate way to achieve well-being, because I believe at the center of it, as I've said before, there's this person, Jesus Christ, who offers us himself. And that, for me, is the ultimate path to true human well-being and flourishing. But obviously, that's going to look very different to Sam Harris's definition of human flourishing or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so this has been a fascinating talk,
So again, I think Justin ended with almost the same thing that he had said earlier, but in the context of the conversation, I think it was very helpful to see exactly how this works. And I love this meme. I think Eric from the Discord server made it up. You established a value hierarchy without simultaneously creating it. You established a value without simultaneously creating a hierarchy. Please tell me more. I love the little Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka face. And so what happens here is that your goal, that which is at the top of the hierarchy, organizes the rest of the elements. The top value will not only govern, but it will limit. And in listening to this conversation again, I think about John Vervaeke as he illuminates what a problem is. Problems always come with constraints. And so you have your objective, and I think Adam had a great example there with the airplane. You have your objective. You want to build an airplane that goes fast, or you want to build an airplane that carries the maximum number of passengers for a minimum amount of fuel. All of those constraints are going to actually give shape to the morality, but there has to be a goal for that morality. And as I argue with the challenge video from Jeff, that I just finished making right before this one. There's a constraint, there's a value hierarchy, and what's so helpful is if you basically have something at the top of your hierarchy which is incorruptible. Now again, in all fairness, Platonism attempts to do this because your forms are incorruptible, but Christ then becomes a very interesting orientation for a community, partly because the dynamics of personhood that we've been exploring in other contexts and in other videos. If I have all these little sub-personalities within me, and what it means to become a fully formed human being means that all these little sub-personalities, all these different elements, the Jungians will talk about my shadow, all of this suddenly now becomes well-formed within me, that I become a coherent person. Well, in terms of Christ being the center of my world, also helps me become a coherent person. Just like with the love song, let's say, so this, your beloved is what your life is. Well, everything in your life is going to orient towards that beloved and not losing that beloved. So therefore, if something happens to the beloved, if she rejects you, if she betrays you, if she dies, even if she just annoys you, now suddenly everything else in your life is going to get disrupted and disorganized. And so this language about Christ being the center, it has to be understood within these hierarchies. And again, Jonathan Peugeot does such a wonderful job in terms of talking about some of these things, but they all form around it. And one of the things that I often say with respect to, a lot of people point to bounded set and centered set. And bounded set and centered set actually are always in dynamic relationship with one another. The center creates the boundaries, and when the center moves, the boundaries readjust. And so bounded and centered are actually two ways of looking at one system, and the top value aligns all of the other values. And this is one of the ongoing difficulties secularism actually has, because it has a very difficult time with ultimates. If the center of your moral hierarchy, if the center of your universe is here within the age of decay, let's say if the beloved is the center of your universe, or if being a moral person is the center of your universe, well, your shadow is going to become a very big problem, because your shadow is always threatening this image of your moral self. And that's why that which orients your universe, in a sense, has to be outside of the weather of the age of decay so that it can properly orient you. And again, other systems do this, such as Platonism, which in a sense sets the forms above things so that actually everything down below is much more durable, because unlike, let's say, making your beloved the center of your world, something happens to your beloved, well then, perhaps they die. Well, what does the rest of your life look like? Well, then you, long and pine, and maybe you die yourself. Now, one of the things that Adam points out is, and this is true also of Jordan Peterson's system, they try to make survival be the center of the system, that which pursues survival. But one difficulty that you have with that is, again, if you go back and look at the Metaphysical Club, the variable was in fact Finchness for Darwin. Finchness, the categorical, was the variable. And again, I highly recommend John Vervaeke's course in all of this, because when he walks through these things, you begin to get a sense of how complicated this really is. And John's concept of relevance realization is really helpful, because it's like, okay, so what's important is survival. Survival of what? If you have, survival of my identity. Well, then you're putting your identity at the top of the hierarchy. And that's an awfully unstable thing, especially given the fact that we grow old, we see things differently, we learn different things. You don't want to be too rigid. In fact, you have a very dynamical system. And so survival itself really doesn't make much sense as something, again, at the top of your system. It will split the world, and all of those issues that Vervaeke talks about in terms of problems, in terms of relevance realizations, in terms of identity of something, they all come to bear. And it's for that reason that Justin's language that he begins with, that Christ is the center, it sounds really difficult to understand. But if you take your time and unpack it a bit and understand that we're not just talking about a beloved, but we're talking about a being who is God, then your whole system can be oriented with that. And it's very difficult, I think, in a secular system to be able to orient these things without something above.